You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by the University of Pennsylvania's Fritz Steiner and Bob Yaro and University of Texas' Ming Zhang to talk about their new book, Megaregions and America's Future. We discuss the idea of megaregions and why they're so important for the future of our society and the planet. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks to everyone that supports the show each month. It's super appreciated. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month gets you our bus-only scarf. And I'll be putting in an order soon for a new edition, our bike-only scarf, full of fresh Kermit. We'll also have more information soon on how to pre-order from our new batch of bus and bike-only scarves, so stay tuned. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Bob Yaro and Fritz Steiner, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Great to be here.
Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves?
So I'm Fritz Steiner, and I'm the Dean of the Stuart Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm also a professor. And before returning to Philadelphia, where I'd been a graduate student many years ago, I was Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Texas in Austin for 15 years.
Bob Yaro. I'm a professor emeritus at Penn. I spent 18 years on the faculty, city and regional planning faculty at Penn, which is where, I began doing this research on megaregions. And I'm also president emeritus of Regional Plan Association in New York, which I led for 25 years until the end of 2014.
Awesome. And Ming Zhang will also join us in a bit. He's the program director and professor of community regional planning at the University of Texas at Austin. He was also my TransCAD professor when I was there. He's also the director of the USDOT University Transportation Center, Cooperative Mobility and Competitive Megaregions, CM2. So I want to ask you all, how did you get interested in cities? Bob, maybe you can go first and then we'll go with Fritz.
Well, I grew up in New York City, and, by definition, you get interested in cities if you grow up in a place like that. And then, during my high school and undergraduate years, America's cities were burning every summer. There were riots in cities. It just struck me that this was an issue that had to be addressed if this country was going to succeed. And I, through a series of connections as an undergraduate at Wesleyan, I got involved. I had an urban studies major, studied with an urban planning professor who helped get me focused on a career in city and regional planning. And I've been at it, for more than 50 years.
One of the things we do in the book, by the way, is all three of us include a reflection of how we got interested in regionalism and cities and megaregions as well.
Yeah, it's really great. I really like that part at the end of the book. There's 3 huge sections and it goes through all of your history. And it's kind of funny because I asked this question of folks who come on the show. And part of the reason why is because everybody kind of has a meandering route as to why they became interested in cities and how they got to the positions they got. And I've had a lot of feedback from listeners, especially young listeners who are thinking about going into planning or transportation or whatever it is, who appreciate all of the different ways that people get into cities and get into transportation. And so it was really great to read that at the end of the book, each of your stories about how you got really interested in cities. And each of you all has a very different story, which is great as well.
Although, the common theme that Fritz and I discovered is that we both, helped lead Earth Day festivities in the first year in 1970, I guess it was, on our campuses. And, we were early participants in the nascent environmental movement. And I think there's a very strong element of that through our careers, but also through the book. I mean, a lot of this is about how we address climate and resilience and so forth at what we think is the most appropriate scale, and one that basically we're not doing very well as a nation right now, or as a world right now.
Why was 2020 the year of the megaregion?
Well, I think, one thing is that when the COVID pandemic hit and sections of the country started shutting down, locking down and so forth, and then later reopening, on a totally ad hoc basis. And more than half of the U.S. megaregions, governors and mayors started to collaborate at the megaregion scale. And it was pretty clear that that was the most appropriate scale for dealing with the pandemic and dealing with both the pandemic itself and its aftermath in the business of putting the economy back on its feet. So in some ways, the pandemic really underscored the importance of addressing issues like this one at that scale.
And Bob notes the Megaregion book became our pandemic project as well.
Yeah, we kidded each other what the subtitle ought to be, what we did on the lockdown. We both had some time to focus on it. And it was a really interesting collaborative, process where we all had a little bit of extra time. They were all very busy anyway, but to focus on the book. And I think it actually helped us keep focused.
Was it something where you had this idea about the book and were starting to put it together ahead of time, and then the pandemic just kind of gave you a little bit more time to work on it? Or was the pandemic somewhat of an impetus for discussing megaregions?
We were all in Manchester, England, where Fritz and I ran a pen studio and Ming ran a UT studio that was focused on the precedent of the Northern Powerhouse Initiative in the UK and how they were dealing with the big natural resource systems in the north of England, and principally the Peak District National Park, where proposal was to run a new high-speed rail line through the park and some improved roadway alignments and so forth. So we were all there and meeting with our peers from the UK who'd been essentially working at this scale for a number of years. And I think it was Ming who took both me and Fritz aside and said, we really ought to take the collective wisdom that has come out of, at that point, more than a dozen years of work on megaregions, both at the international and national scale, but also at the megaregion scale in the Northeast and Texas Triangle and so forth. So let's see if we can pull together the collective wisdom into a book. That's really where the idea came from. But we had all been working on this issue in various ways, going back to 2004. So what you see is a compilation and codification of, what we've learned over all that time through all these projects.
I'm also wondering, what specifically is a megaregion? Like, what constitutes the geography that you all put together as defining what the megaregion is and what it might be?
Well, the short answer is when more than two metropolitan regions have grown together. And the classic megaregion in the United States is the Northeast megaregion from Boston to, south of Washington, D.C. Of course, the French geographer Jean Gottman wrote his classic 1961. And then Bob can pick up the story where he started to observe when he was teaching a studio here, looking at the future of the United States, that agglomeration of metropolitan areas with areas beside the Northeast.
Yeah, we, in partnership with Armando Carbonell at Lincoln Institute and John Barnett, who was a practice professor at Penn, I convened a studio called the Plan for America Studio. And basically, I've been doing some work at RPA and at OECD in Paris, where I was rubbing elbows with our European counterparts who were thinking at this scale. And there were a group of academics from several European countries who were working on an EU-funded project to look at the big systems, transportation, economic, environmental, and other systems that were functioning at the continental scale in Europe and at what we would now call the megaregion scale. And they identified several of these places in Europe. And a few other things that just happened. I'd finished the third regional plan at 1996 at RPA. And we were beginning to think about how what we were doing could fit into a larger northeastern scale and so forth. The Census Bureau in about 1997 or 98 came out with forecasts that suggested that the country was going to add, something like 50% to its population by the middle of the century. And the question is, well, where are we going to put these people? And how are we going to accommodate this growth? So we convened this studio and did some long-range land use change, population, and economic forecasts. And what we began to see when we looked at the maps of expanding metros across the country was the emergence of what we now call megaregions. At first, we called them super cities because that's what they were. There were these networks of cities that were beginning to function together. Armando Carbonell felt that given the anti-urban bias throughout American history, that we ought to come up with a term that wasn't inflammatory. And so that's where Armando suggested the megaregion terminology, which is stuck. And it was interesting. I described it as a kind of an accident of my poor vision that when I started looking at these maps that the students had prepared, we were in London with Sir Peter Hall, who hosted the studio that year. and with a group of Andreas Faludi from the Technical University at Delft and Vincent Goodstadt from the Royal Town Planning Institute and others, European experts, started looking at these maps, and what you saw over time was that the suburbs of Philly had really grown into the suburbs of New York in Mercer County, New Jersey, around Trenton, and similarly the suburbs of Raleigh, Durham, and Atlanta and Birmingham and the other mega regions, Texas Triangle, same thing, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston. The suburbs were starting to grow together, and it triggered, our thinking that, well, there must be something more going on here. We started to do research on the interactions economically and in terms of natural systems and so forth in these places, and found that, in fact, there was a significant amount of interaction. There were, real advantages to these places. We also did work. We did a series of studios at Penn, and the UT joined us on a few of them. That's where I think Fritz and Ming got involved. And starting in 2005 or 6, Fritz, I think we started doing those.
Yeah, Ming and I, but also Kent Butler.
Margie Dewar from the University of Michigan, Ethan Seltzer from Portland State, Mark Pisano from Southern California Association of Governments, and others. Of course, Catherine Ross, who coined the term Piedmont Atlantic Megaregion, region around Atlanta and Southeast. Anyway, so we started bringing together scholars who saw the same trends emerging in all of these places. Started the economists' term as agglomeration economies, that were starting to see serious economic benefits coming out of both potential and existing collaborations. The other thing we learned from the Europeans and the Asians was that the mode of choice in mega regions around the world is high-speed rail, and that particularly in a country where the interstate highway system has become very congested and has become increasingly inefficient as a means of moving passengers and goods, that we needed to create improved transportation links between these places. And what we learned from research on European and Japanese and Chinese and Korean high-speed rail and others, was that there was a sweet spot between something like 300 and 700 or 800 miles in which high-speed rail was hands down a winner compared with commercial aviation and with highway access, and raised the question, well, why was the U.S., one of a few industrializing countries that didn't have high-speed rail? And so a big part of the research program was in how high-speed rail could be advanced in this country. One other thing, after the Penn Studio, we convened a number of these scholars from around the country and around the world at a roundtable at the Rockefeller Brothers Conference Center at Pecanico, New York. And out of that came a collaboration between Regional Plan and Penn and Lincoln called America 2050. That was a multi-year exercise to look at long-range population, economic, land use, environmental trends in this country and how they could be managed. And that furthered a lot of the research that we were doing at Penn and at the other institutions across the country, and a lot of the international collaborations.
In addition to the transportation planning advantages of mega regions, we also saw pretty quickly that there were environmental advantages, which are really important given climate change. So air and water are big systems. Looking at the mega region scale, if you're going to do something like climate reserves because of the heating planet, the mega regional scale is very helpful in figuring that kind of thing out.
Yeah, what I also like is that you all were discussing megaregions from that environmental standpoint, looking at ecoregions, river drainage basins. I'm curious why that's just important as the economic connections, because there is something to be said about connecting a larger ecosystem that's not just a small park. It actually could be regional. It could be almost statewide, even larger. And, we had Billy Fleming on to talk about Design with Nature Now last year. And it was interesting to think about those projects and the ones in places like China and some of the flooding in Europe that they allow for big river systems. Why is the megaregion so important from an environmental standpoint?
Well, notably, E.O. Wilson and Bob's good friend Tony Hiss both have advocated the half Earth idea, that we should be setting aside half of the planet for conservation, or we're going to lose more and more species. So in order to have areas that are big enough, you have to think big. And it's also has to do with the connectivity, and especially river systems and stream systems. They're not only transportation systems for us, but they're also highways for other species as well. And also just looking at climate. And for example, if you get on a train in Philadelphia and go to Baltimore and you look out the window, on one side you've got I-95, and on the other side, a lot of the way there's water. And, a 2-meter rise, it doesn't take much of a scientist to realize that Amtrak line is going to be underwater in many places. And so is the highway at the Philadelphia airport. So finding places for transportation that also values wildlife and other species is, again, something that needs to be done at a larger scale.
You also talk about how you can actually implement the megaregion and the structures that are needed to actually, put something like this together. I'm wondering, you discuss governance structures in the book, and there are existing structures like MPOs, MSAs, counties, states that actually have existing structures. But are those geographic units helpful, or do they actually get in the way of this thinking about a larger region connected by economics and the environment?
Well, in some ways they get in the way. And, the federal system has become sclerotic in most of this country. And, we think that the federal government can play a really important role in incentivizing collaborations between the states and leading on mega region scale initiatives around all of these systems, the high speed and other transportation investments, the big climate initiatives and so forth. And it's a little like what we did with the interstate highway system, where in the 3 years prior to the adoption of the Interstate National Defense Highway System Act in 1956, the Republican Governors Association adopted resolutions calling for the abolition of Bureau of Public Roads and elimination of the federal gas tax. And it was only when Eisenhower appointed the Clay Committee and that recommended moving ahead with the interstate system, and I think it was originally a 4-cent a gallon federal gasoline tax to pay for it. And then with the White House putting some muscle behind the proposal, that the governors kind of got on board. And they did a series of demonstration projects across the country. And then the rest of the governors said, we want in. That kind of thing that probably needs to happen. I know we're coming out of a period in which the federal government hasn't provided a lot of leadership on issues like this one, but that's, probably needed. We also, describe projects like the RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, and some others that are collaborative efforts between states. And that's about leadership at the gubernatorial level. Bill Weld in Massachusetts, George Pataki in New York, and others, Republican governors, led the creation of this voluntary initiative to cap power plant generated greenhouse gases. And it's been a very effective approach. So that kind of thing we think has the potential to move ahead as well. But it's going to require that we kind of get out of our own way. And there's a Lincoln quote that we put in the head of one of the chapters about how we have to disenthrall ourselves from the quiet dogmas of the past. So we really do have to get out of our own way and start to think like we're in this new Anthropocene epoch. We're in this new, competitive ethic that President Biden characterizes as a global competition between democracies and the autocracies and so forth, and to compete successfully to address climate, the other big issues that we face. We've got to start thinking at this new scale in a much more ambitious way. And the book outlines various strategies for getting there.
Also, some of the mega regions have an advantage if they want to use it, and that is they're within one state. So the Northeast and the Piedmont Atlantic get very complicated in the Gulf Coast, but the Texas Triangle, with the right leadership in Texas, they would be in a really leadership role. Northern California and Southern California, both within one state, Florida, the Sun Corridor, and Arizona. All of those have the advantage of being within a single state, and one doesn't have to work with a lot of different states and a lot of small municipalities.
Is it hard to focus on a couple of geographic areas while others might feel a little bit left out of the discussion? In the book, you specifically mentioned that rural areas disconnected from these megaregions generally suffer a bit more. I'm wondering, how there's a connection to everywhere in the country and kind of keeping everybody involved when there are these megaregions and these places that are kind of excelling over others around the country.
We identified, we called them hinterlands around each of the mega regions, large rural areas that would benefit from strengthened connections to the heart of each of their mega regions. And when you add those all up, they encompass 90 or 95% of the population of the country, leave out only a handful of very isolated rural regions. So these strategies really ought to be benefiting virtually the entire country. And, one of the things we did in the book was to look at some of the places. I think we had 2 mega regions that we really hadn't focused on before in the heartland, in the center of the country around Kansas City and Oklahoma City and so forth. And then the mega region around the Great Basin. We call it Basin and Range, Salt Lake and Boise and Idaho City and other, smaller places. They don't have the same population base as the others, but they are growing like gangbusters and have the potential to achieve the same kinds of advantages that the other mega regions have. And there's a big focus in the book on the left behind areas, cities and regions that have been left out of the prosperity of the country of the last 4 decades. And we think it's critically important that those places be brought back into the mainstream of population and economic growth. And there's strategies that we describe in the book that achieve that.
It all falls together fairly neatly. And, it's also what to do about how do you involve Alaska and Hawaii because they're not connected with the other states. And of course, Alaska is very tied to the Pacific Northwest. And you start to think in terms of British Columbia, Vancouver, the connection between Portland, Seattle, and Anchorage is actually quite strong and has been historically. And Hawaii has very strong connections with California in particular. Even though there are some places that aren't part of the mega regions themselves, that doesn't mean they're not connected and benefit from mega regional thinking as well.
One of the other things that got me when I was reading the book was the generational trends and the population change. And I'm curious why those matter so much for this discussion about megaregions and for agglomeration, conurbations more generally in the future.
It's important also just because that's where the growth is occurring. That's where people are moving. So it's the phenomena of growth that especially young people are moving in significant numbers to the megaregions. That's why they're growing as fast as they are.
And one of the things that we did that Ming analyzed, there's a chapter in the book that describes the growing racial and social divisions in the megaregions and at the megaregion scale. Obviously, it's a concern for the whole country. And what you see in the book, the Gini coefficients, these measures of growing inequity, are increasing everywhere in the country. Some, more in some megaregions than others. And, it's another argument for thinking at the scale to address what we think is one of the fundamental issues facing the country, which is how to address the growing racial and social divisions.
I'm curious if there's a question that folks don't ask you about when you're talking about megaregions. I think that there's a lot of discussion about kind of the construct of them, probably the high-speed rail aspect of them, the connections and those types of things. But is there something that you don't get asked a lot when you're talking about the book?
I think the climate issues haven't been in the foreground and, people haven't been probing on that. What are your thoughts, Fritz?
I think the climate is one that is climate and social justice became even more important during the period we were writing the book. So we couldn't, not that we would have ignored them anyway, but it I think became more present. Maybe there's two things that one Bob usually points out is there's a heritage of national scale planning in the United States that most Americans aren't familiar with. And it is really during those periods which the United States put an emphasis on building railroads or building freeways that are the periods of great economic growth and prosperity in the country. And so I think that that's something that is often maybe not as well appreciated as it should be. The other is there's a cultural heritage to these places. And if you live in Texas, you identify with Texas, and the Texas Triangle is a real thing. It's not something that we kind of made up. It's something that, and the Pacific Northwest is also similar. There's an identity to, it's sometimes called utopia that is our Cascadia. There's awareness of cultural history there. And if you go back even further, many of these places, indigenous people in Philadelphia, the Lenape people, basically used the ridgeline Philadelphia and New York for their highway. That's where I-95 and the New Jersey Turnpike. I think it'd be much more pleasant, the Lenape way of getting to New York along the high ground. There's deep geological, biological, and cultural histories to these regions that I think make them really fascinating.
The Great Lakes megaregion, when we started working out there, the locals started calling it the Kielbasa Belt. Because it's basically the large Polish and Eastern European population stretching from Buffalo, New York to Milwaukee. So there really is a culinary, but there's also a kind of a cultural heritage. And, a number of the megaregions have those characteristics. Going back to Fritz's point about the need for federal leadership and the history of national scale planning at this scale is a rich one. Bob Fishman of the University of Michigan, his quip is that, Americans think that national scale planning is something best left to the French, he says. And then he goes on to say, au contraire. And it turns out that there's this, 230-year history going back to Jefferson and Lincoln and both Roosevelts and Eisenhower that really created the national economy, the national infrastructure system, and that much of this happened during periods of social and economic strife. Everybody knows that Lincoln advanced the Transcontinental Railroad. What they don't know as well is that he also advocated for a whole national network of Western railways, the Morrill Act creating the land-grant university system, the Homestead Act, the controller of the currency and the greenback and the modern currency in this country and financial controls. The National Academy of Sciences, came out of the Lincoln administration. During the Civil War, they had a few other things to worry about, and we think that we're in one of those periods when you look at this global competition that we're in, with the autocracies, the climate emergency, the racial and social justice. We've got a series of emergencies here that require bold leadership at the federal level. And we haven't seen it in a while. Obviously, Joe Biden is trying to do some of these things with the bipartisan infrastructure bill as a down payment on infrastructure needs and high-speed rail, but it's only a down payment. And that's something that we hope that discussion in the book can help popularize a broader examination of the federal role and the need for federal leadership.
Yeah, I like that anecdote in the book about somebody asking you why we don't have a national planning department. And I'm wondering if you ever thought that would be a possibility to have a national planning department.
Well, it's funny, in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, the New Deal, national planning, I guess, is fighting words in some circles. And, so
Yes.
It had a couple of, names, National Resources Planning Administration, that was led by Frederick Delano, the president's uncle, conveniently, and was created by executive order of the president and was in the White House. And they did the kind of large, thinking about the New Deal and WPA and PWA and all the big regional development projects, the TVA, the Bonneville Power Administration, the Colorado River Project, and others. And those projects really created the modern geography and economy of the United States. And things don't just happen. It was part of a national scale planning effort, a product of leadership from the President of the United States, and a dozen years to make those things happen. Time to do it again. We're kind of resting on our laurels in this country. We've got 150-year-old infrastructure systems that are all out of date. Many of them well beyond their use-by dates. The bipartisan infrastructure bill basically allows us to patch up some 50 and 100-year-old infrastructure systems, but for the most part doesn't create the systems that we're going to need for the next 100 years. And as Fritz said, we're going to have to redesign all of these systems to deal with climate change and sea level rise. All of the other, manifestations of climate change.
Other countries are way ahead of us with this. So certainly China, with high-speed rail, as well as what they're doing in the environment, but also countries like South Korea and Japan, which are more democratic and managed to move ahead. And then in the EU and the United Kingdom, also there's, movement. Clearly, the sad situation in Ukraine is also moving closer together and speaking together on things and cooperating. And so I think it's a real challenge for us. I think we need to get our act together.
We did a pen studio 5-6 years ago at Beijing with one of our colleagues, Richard Weller, and Marilyn Taylor, former dean. And it was looking at the Jinjiangji region around Beijing and Tianjin and so forth. And one of the discussions was at the China Academy of Planning and Urban Design, where I was presented with this bound set of America 2050 documents that had been, translated into Mandarin and then beautifully published in a way that we never could afford to publish them, with the fancy bindings and so forth. And these concepts have been taken to heart by China, by Korea, by the European Union, by a number of other places that are now thinking and operating at the megaregion scale. They're investing at that scale. They're organizing national economic development and national climate strategies, at that scale and so forth. And so, it's an idea that originated, at Penn and UT and the others, that has now been adopted by, our global competitors in many ways. And it's time to catch up. I know I'm a big fan of American exceptionalism, but this is one place where, we probably don't want to be that exceptional. It's interesting to see that China's, national development strategies been built around high-speed rail, but it's also been built around the idea that they could bring interior regions and the central part of the country into the economic orbit of the big coastal megaregions, and they started to think of Jinjiangxi around Beijing and the Pearl River Delta around Hong Kong and Guangzhou and the Yangtze River Delta around Shanghai. They've been planning at that scale now for 15 or 20 years and investing at that scale with high-speed rail and other water projects and so forth that are designed at that scale. And it's really about spreading the wealth. It goes back to your question earlier about how to bring the hinterlands in on this deal. And the Chinese have been doing that. The Koreans have been doing the same thing. They've organized a national economic development strategy around the Korea high-speed rail system that includes decanting government agencies and universities and research institutions out of Seoul into other underperforming areas of Korea. The rest of the world is thinking and acting at this scale, and we haven't been up until now. And we hope that we start to do that, or we really are putting ourselves at a disadvantage in this global economic and now security competition that's emerging.
My mentor here at Penny Park twice proposed national ecological plans for the United States, and they weren't enacted. But China has, under Keng Zheng-yu, a faculty member at Peking University, has developed a national ecological security plan for China, looking at the natural resources that are necessary for them to achieve clean water, clean air, and food into the future. It's pretty remarkable.
We're joined now by Ming. I see you in the bottom corner there.
Hey, Ming.
How's it going?
Hey, Ming.
Hi, Jeff.
How are you doing? Good to see you.
Bob.
Hey, how are you, Ming?
Good to see you again.
There was a question before about why it's important to understand the demographic changes going on in each megaregion, and in particular which ones are aging more rapidly and which ones have the greater growing social and racial divisions and so forth. And maybe you could comment on that.
Sure. In terms of the aging trend, the observation I had from looking at the data is that spatially, aging population is increasingly concentrated in the outskirts of metropolitan area and also in the non-metropolitan counties area. So challenges facing aging population and given their locational disadvantages must take a megaregion in a sense, a broader spatial perspective, a geographical perspective than just metropolitan area or even city. So basically then we're leaving out those population groups that are facing increasing challenges due to aging, due to their housing locations, and then their mobility limitations. And then in terms of the ethnic minority population, I guess different cities, different regions have different histories, and then different dynamics in terms of neighborhood changes and demographic shifts. In Austin, as you know, Jeff, the East Austin, right, has been traditionally ethnic minority, African-American, nowadays Hispanic population with lower income. So they are facing increasing risk of being displaced due to gentrification, the expansion of downtown Austin functions, for example, to the east. So looking at the changes of those demographic population and neighborhood changes can provide us with an updated picture, updated image on where and who are facing great challenges, whether it's access challenges, services, or others, education and health challenges. So to put it in a simple way, so I add spatial dimension to the demographic changes, with particularly focusing on the vulnerable population, the elderly, and then the low-income ethnic minorities.
That's interesting from a housing perspective and thinking about housing generally in the context of today, which is getting more and more expensive. And especially spatially how the United States is laid out, where urban cores are more walkable, generally better served by transit versus suburban areas, which are not. It's an interesting discussion about how the megaregion can impact that discussion about housing, but also vulnerable populations and how ethnic minorities are situated. So I'm curious how you all think about housing in terms of the megaregion context and what the benefits are of thinking from this larger scale versus maybe at a smaller scale of a city. Here in California and here in the Bay Area specifically, we have so many little jurisdictions and fiefdoms that it's hard to, get everybody on the same page on the housing discussion and to think a bit larger, say from that Northern California megaregion geography.
There's a section of the book that looks at how we need to reconfigure urban, regional, mega-regional transportation systems to address this issue and the other, demographic issues that Ming was talking about. And, this idea of redesigning urban rail networks, commuter rail networks where they exist, and to become regional rail networks. The rest of the world, the high-speed rail lines are, essentially large-scale mass transit systems, and with pricing policies that are designed to allow workers to commute from, often distant places into center cities in Tokyo and Paris and, London and so forth. And, we used to think at that scale in this country, when we created the urban rail systems around, mostly the eastern cities and Chicago and a few others. We haven't quite gotten there. The BART system's never really designed to be a mass transit system or to cover the whole region. And it was never coordinated with land use strategies. There were never any incentives for, or requirements for communities to start to plan for and zone around transit. It was almost like zoning out development around transit in the suburban, the East Bay region around San Francisco and so forth. So there's a section of the book that discusses, innovations in other parts of the world. Crossrail opened in London this week, and articles in the British papers about how it's being heavily used even in the post-COVID era, and it is transforming mobility patterns and transforming housing markets across the greater London region. And Crossrail was designed as, to be the down payment on a network of large regional rail projects in London, Crossrail 2 and Crossrail, 3 on the boards being planned and so forth. And that's the scale we ought to be thinking about here. I'm always reminded, through my 25 years at regional plan in New York, that, 1929 plan, we proposed the creation of the IND subway system that was, double the size of the rapid transit system around New York City, and the proposal was also there to build its counterpart in New Jersey and up into Hudson Valley and Connecticut and so forth. Only the IND system happened really, although some of it's come along since then. But the goal was to deal with the over congestion and the big run up in housing prices in the core of the New York region in the 1920s. And it worked. The places that had been farmland in Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx, turned into Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. And, with 2/3 of the population of the city in the service area of the IND subway system, I have this notion that every half century or so, you have to think at this larger scale about how to address, seemingly insoluble problems. We just aren't thinking at that scale. And it's, we've been dumbed down by 40 or 50 years of thinking that we can't do big things anymore in this country, that, we have to just cut taxes and hope that things turn out for the better, and not good enough anymore. So anyway, so I think the answer is that thinking at this larger scale, investing at this larger scale can help us address all of these issues, including the issue of rapidly escalating housing prices, growing racial and social divisions.
I totally agree with what Bob just described or characterized. The high-speed rail offers kind of like a space and time shrinking technology that brings opportunities for housing and for jobs and services closer, even though it's at a mega-regional scale. It's happening in many European cities and Asian cities, in China, for example, as well. People can live in one city and work in another, and then commute. Even daily commute, they can achieve through high-speed rail. I'd like to add kind of a similar integration between transportation and housing choices at the local scale as well. Jeff, you may have heard the news, read the news that Austin voters approved a $7.1 billion investments, right, for 2 new light rail transit, one commuter rail, and then several metro rapid bus network. I think integrating transportation services, in particular public transportation services with housing supply and affordable housing supply, can offer broader solutions to, say, housing displacement challenges or gentrification challenges than just looking at the housing sector itself. People can access downtown Austin jobs without living there if there is a reliable, high-quality public transportation network connecting downtown with whatever neighborhoods people live in. Jeff, I guess you may have worked on this, right? This H plus T index, H plus T approach considers affordability not just about housing, but kind of a housing plus transportation cost together.
I would add, Ming, that we were writing this book during the depths of the pandemic and the emergence of the hybrid work patterns that we're now seeing around the world. And we think that the advent of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday work week and people who are now commuting 1, 2, 3 days a week into a center city office, that in fact the new rail networks that we're proposing in the book really support that and really enable people to live in more isolated and usually lower cost locations and still have access to center city jobs, particularly if they're commuting only a few days a week, 1, 2, 3 days a week, a longer distance commute, particularly if it's on a high performance or high speed, line. What it allows us to do is to dramatically expand labor markets and housing markets across this larger mega region scale geography. There's a profile in the book on the North Atlantic region, which is the northern half of the Northeast, New York to Boston and New England, which describes how these commuting patterns are emerging and how the transportation system really needs to catch up to enable that to really work. Right now we got this big run up in housing prices in urban areas and the core of metropolitan areas across the country. In large part because you have to live in the core in order to have access to the economy in the core and the close-in suburbs. You can't count on highways, like over congested highways, to move over longer distances. And this is one of the arguments for high-speed and high-performance rail and things like the California High-Speed Rail Project and certainly North Atlantic Rail.
It's really interesting in California specifically. I know that there was a lot of calls to skip over, the Merceds and the Bakersfields and the Fresnos and just go down I-5 and connect Los Angeles and San Francisco.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a folly to that in that you're disconnecting those areas, which have a huge population. I mean, I think the Central Valley has 3.5 million or plus people, probably even more now since I last did the math. But there's a whole host of areas that can be connected to the larger, economic centers that makes a really good, good point. And if we're thinking about the H plus T that Ming was talking about, I worked with CNT and strategic economics and my organization Reconnecting America when we were at the Center for TOD. And a lot of our work focused on looking at transit lines and housing related. And one of the things that we found was when you're building lines one at a time, like Charlotte or like Minneapolis or other places, you actually put a lot more housing pressure on those corridors than you would if you had a network built all across the region.
Right.
And I think that one of the things that we also saw was some of the legacy regions, the Philadelphias and the New Yorks and the Chicagos, where transit was already a network and was already there. The pressure wasn't as profound. So if you can expand that to high-speed rail into a more regional / mega regional context, I think that actually has been shown already from a lower geographical size that actually will work to alleviate some of the pressure that regions are feeling.
Yeah, it's interesting that if you look at the profile on the North Atlantic region and the proposal to create a network of, we call them high performance, these are 110 mile per hour services connecting all of the older, mid-sized cities across New England and downstate New York. And these are the places, going back to the earlier discussion, that have been left out of the prosperity of the last 40 years. They haven't recovered from the loss of manufacturing activities in the 1970s and 80s. And, we think that by connecting these places into, in a network with each other and with the engines of the North Atlantic region economy in Boston and New York, that in fact we have the opportunity to revitalize these places, to integrate housing markets into a larger kind of mega region scale, housing market. And, and yes, there'll be a modest uptick in housing prices in those places, but there will be at the same time, a significant increase in job opportunities and other economic advantages to the residents of those places. A lot of them have been losing population for 40 or 50 years, a lot of gap sites, a lot of potential for redevelopment and infill and so forth. Opportunities for higher density development around in station areas and urban centers. I think as part of that profile, we looked at Hartford, Connecticut, which has got several hundred acres of surface parking, unused surface parking. I mean, there's not even a market for surface parking. It's just the lowest rung on the economic ladder, all of which could be infilled and redeveloped with new housing and some commercial development around a high-speed rail stop and a network of high-performance rail connections to other mid-sized cities across New England. So those are big opportunities for us, but they only happen if, in fact, we start to think and act at this larger scale.
What's been the response to the book so far?
Well, we know the first printing sold out in the first month, which we were pleased to hear. And Lincoln and Columbia, have ordered a second printing that's 3 times the size. So it's a good sign. So there's been a buzz around it. We haven't been invited to be on Morning Joe yet, but as these things go, I think it's been well received.
Yeah, I heard from NCT COG, the North Central Texas Council of Government. They ordered 100 copies of a book, 1 or 2 weeks after its formal release.
That's awesome.
I spoke to one high-level official in the Biden administration who Ming sent her a copy, and then I asked her how she liked the book, and she said, "I haven't gotten it because my husband insisted on reading it first, and he runs a think tank in New York." And so I said, "Okay, that's a good sign." So I think there's been a fair amount of interest in it. We're just starting to really beat the bushes on it. And, we'll be hitting the conference circuit in the fall and next spring. And hopefully it'll get a fair amount of attention then.
Well, I think the value in the book is getting people to think a little bit bigger. And lately, I think many people, including myself, have been kind of bogged down in the minutia of things, watching the BBB too closely or the infrastructure bill, what's actually in it versus what we wish would be in it. And actually, in reading the book myself, I actually had a lot of ideas, many bad ideas, but it still helps me get kind of some ideas flowing,
Yeah, no bad idea.
I'm curious, though, do you all feel a little bit more hopeful after writing the book, even given the political realities you see out there that might be pushing back on the idea of a mega region?
Look, I think, all of us have had careers that have been about putting big ideas out there. At RPA, we always talked about, advancing ideas whose time has not yet come. And in my experiences, if you put big ideas out there and popularize them, then eventually, people rise to the occasion. We had this experience in January where we had a bunch of multi-billion-dollar transportation projects in the third regional plan in 1996 that hadn't gone anywhere because we couldn't get a governor of New York to raise their hand and say, "Hey, that's worth doing." And then Governor Hochul included 3 of them in her State of the State address in January, and with serious proposals for funding in the state budget. Second phase of Second Avenue Subway, a new, we called it Triborough RX. It's one that we did a studio on at Penn where we kind of embellished the idea. A new surface transportation line linking, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, very analogous to the London Overground. And, we ran a studio where we took students to London to understand the Overground and how it could be applied. And then a third one was the Penn Access project, bringing Metro North service, Westchester and Connecticut commuters directly into Penn Station instead of Grand Central. And, so look, it took 25 years for a governor to come along and salute, but the ideas were out there, and we're all getting too old to wait 25 years to do these things any longer. But, I'm hopeful that in fact, we're going to see some, prominent elected officials and opinion leaders and others get behind these ideas, because we have to do it. This global competition that we're in, this, the climate issue, the racial and social justice issue, even the national defense issues and how we sustain a defense establishment to compete against the autocracies. We can't win those competitions unless we start to think and act at this scale.
From my kind of interactions with people, including my colleagues here in CRP program, Jeff, and also some public officials from the city and DOTs. And I feel that those who are skeptical about megaregions mainly think about the institutional gap currently at the megaregional level. There's no such an institutional setting for megaregional actions to take place, because it's between state and local municipalities, local governments. Of course, some across different states. But it's not like an MPO, for example, responsible for designate areas, long-range transportation plan. So they have the institutional arrangement for that. But for megaregions, and the people say, well, it's a good idea, but there's no such an entity to implement, or there's no such a kind of a mechanism for different players, for different megaregion constituencies to work together. I think that's one topic or one issue that megaregion research should explore. One important aspect. Well, the first one is, of course, it's what mega, the term means, right? A big, huge, a larger region. Another one I think is more widespread is the issues across multiple jurisdictions, whether it's transportation issues, it's environmental issues, health services, and others. With that, many agencies like DOT, state DOTs, TxDOT, and then the cities, they are aware of the cross-jurisdictional challenges they are facing, but they don't have the manpower, legal power, the financial power to work with those. I feel that's why many people are kind of suspicious about this mega-regional framework. But it's because of the lack of such a institutional setting, then we need to come up with some creative way for inter-agency, inter-municipality cooperation to address those challenges, problems outside the boundaries of their jurisdiction.
Well, Ming, we didn't have MPOs until the 1960s when the Johnson administration decided that we needed them. And, it goes back to my notion that every 50 or so years, you have to start thinking you have to start innovating. I'm also reminded that, when the experience of the interstate highway system, where the Republican governors said they didn't want them. Wonderful testimony with Senator Thurmond, on the proposed beltways. Now, who's going to use these beltways? Why, these are just boondoggles. No one's going to use these beltways. And boy, a funny thing happened on the way to 90-10 funding. When the federal government said to those states, here's 90% of the cost of these things. What do you think? And the answer then was that 48 states signed up for the program. And, but it required that somebody lean over a railing in the White House and say, God damn it, we're doing this. And, and that was a moderate Republican governor. So in theory, we're capable of doing these things. But again, it comes back to vision and then leadership. And then I think, yes, threats. I mean, it's the national defense and interstate highway system. It was about, competing in the Cold War, economically as well as militarily, and in terms of transportation capacity. So that's what has to happen. I hope that at some point we're going to find, a select group of mayors, hopefully somebody at the White House who will sign on to, these ideas. That's what it takes. And again, it's always, in American history, always been in a period of crisis that we've acted on big ideas like this one. And I would argue that we're in a period of crisis, and that requires that we think in bold and innovative new ways.
Well, there's lots of bold and innovative ideas in the book. The book is Megaregions and America's Future. You can, I imagine, find it at your bookstores of choice. We always ask people go to their local bookstores. So you can go to bookshop.org, IndieBound, et cetera, probably to get this. Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Columbia University Press. Ming and Bob and Fritz, who was here earlier, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate your interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Hidways.